Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special meeting of children and young people this afternoon for Monmouthshire. I'm Tudor Thomas and I'm Chair of Children and Young People, and I will obviously chair this scrutiny meeting this afternoon. So, croeso i'r cyfarfod plant a bobl ifanc prynawn yma yn Sir Fynwy. We'll now then go to the agenda, and the first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. I've received apologies from County Councillor Martin Grocott and from Malcolm Lane, who's unfortunately unwell. So those are the only apologies that I've received. Item 2, declarations of interest. If you have declarations, please declare them now, or if they become apparent during the meeting, then again, obviously, please declare them at that point, and I will obviously accept it and it will be noted in the minutes. Item 3 on the agenda, we now go to budget scrutiny, and this is scrutiny of the budget proposals for 2022-23, and the Cabinet Member, County Councillor Phil Murphy, for resources and budget has kindly come in now and will take us through the budget proposals. Thanks. Phil.
Thank you, Chair, and just bear with me a sec while I share my screen. And the next thing is to try and organise it so that we get on to PowerPoint a little bit easier. You've got the main screen up there, have you?
Yes, that's fine.
Is that okay now?
Yeah, that's clear now, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tudor. Right, so my apologies for those who've seen it before several times, but as we were saying just before we started recording, it does help to listen to it a couple of times, because you can pick different things out of it. So without any more ado, we'll go through the Council's budget plans for 22-23. And in this budget, we're determined to do all we can to support our communities in recovering from the pandemic and protect and enhance the services we know our residents rely on. This is a budget that delivers on our core priorities, including the longer-term challenges that feature in our updated strategic aims and are set out in our strategy to summer 22, which is known as Looking Ahead and Delivering Now, if anybody wants to look it up. So we're offering children the best possible start in life with more money for schools, helping our older residents retain their independence with better pay for care workers, protecting our leisure centres, recognising their important role in mental and physical well-being, working towards a low-carbon Monmouthshire, more investments in roads, cycle routes and footpaths and improved broadband, so a better connected Monmouthshire, and protecting bus routes, and with a continued rollout of 20-mile-an-hour zones in our towns and villages, making those a safer environment as well. So it's a budget that looks to the future, positioning the council to take on some of the biggest challenges facing our county and in society more generally. So we'll continue to be at the forefront of the transition to net zero carbon. So, though this requires investment, as does our commitment to eradicate homelessness in the county. We will focus on narrowing health inequalities that have become increasingly evident during the pandemic. We're committed to social care reform. Care as a career needs to be valued much more highly. We will ensure that schools are resourced to help children whose learning has been disrupted by the pandemic to be able to make up for lost time, with more investment in mental health and wellbeing support, and we will continue our multi-million-pound school investment programme. We will increase the emphasis of our work to help people protect and manage their own mental health and well-being. We've successfully managed to take some 18.2 million out of the budget over the last 4 years. And as you'll see in a slide that's coming up next, that's getting harder and harder to achieve, and particularly given the pandemic, which has brought its own source of issues. The council continues to face ongoing and significant financial, demographic and demand-led pressures, some 10.41 million of unavoidable service pressures this year and 4.96 million of pay pressures coming through into 22-23 that continue to bear heavily on the council's finances. So despite a positive and very welcome and above average funding settlement that we've had from Welsh Government this time, we still remain the worst funded council in Wales on a per capita basis. That slide I mentioned just now shows you the extent of the problem. If you look back 4 years in terms of pay pressures, you'll see that for the first 3 of those 4 years, there was, I shouldn't have done that, just bear with me a sec. For the first 3 of those years, it was much of a muchness. In 21-22, the pressure was considerably reduced, but it's come back with a vengeance now at that 4.6 million. And if we look at the specific service pressures, you'll see how they're climbing, getting more or less the same as last year this time, but considerably greater than the unavoidable pressures in, say, 18-19. And if you look at the service efficiencies, more or less the same each year. We always used to say we'd have to find about 5 million each year, but we've only been able to find 1.4 this time. It's getting harder and harder and harder to keep redesigning services to get budgetary savings. There's the very welcome additional money that we got through the Welsh Government settlement, and you can see those settlements improving as we go forward. A little bit from income generation, not too different from the previous year. And if we manage to, if we stay within our working assumption of a 3.95% increase in council tax, although we're doing what we can to try not to have to do that, but at the moment that's it. 3.126 million would be the result of that. So you can see there that we still need £863,000 worth of reserve funding to enable this budget to work as it stands at the moment in its draft stage. So it's another unprecedented year. The pandemic response has continued and its impact is being felt and will continue to be felt, I suspect. We've got more costs. Our costs are rising with our ageing population, an increased demand for core services, high resident expectations, pay and contract inflation and legislative impacts. But there's a need to invest in the future to ensure services offered remain relevant and appropriate in meeting the county's needs, whilst making sure everything is as efficient and effective as possible. As I said, there's insufficient funding. Whilst Welsh Government funding increases, it's insufficient to cover all the pay and service pressures. So there's a need to make that saving of 863,000 one-off reserves to support the council alongside the response to the pandemic. But as you know, we continue to challenge services to sustain themselves rather than to see closure of services that matter, on the basis that if things close, they never return. It's better to scale back and redesign than to withdraw. So what do we get and where do we get it from? The core funding, AEF, external finance, 112 million. 70 million from council tax, and there's that 863,000 that we need to get from reserves. So if you look at that on a pie chart, there's that blue little slither there, that's the reserve funding, but you can see it's a 60-40 split now, more or less. The amount of that we're having to collect from council tax is getting more and more and more. So as I said, we're working on a model of increase of 3.95% at the moment. We continue to work on that, but at the moment we've got no other viable options. Our reserve funding, the contingency money that we have to plan for the unexpected, is already at low levels, although we have managed to top it up in the last couple of years through budget surpluses. But as you'll see in a minute, we've got a couple of very heavy years coming in terms of budgetary pressure. So if we can possibly not have to draw on some or all of that 863,000, we will certainly aim to do that. So Monmouthshire residents always like to see this slide. So the average Band D household will see an increase if we stay at 3.95 of £1.09 per week for the MCC element only of the council tax increase. Some town and community councils I know are considering very considerable increases, and that will obviously impact on their residents. But the MCC element that I'm responsible for would only be just over £1 a week. So if you look at the Band D equivalent, a lot of people seem to think that Monmouthshire is an expensive place to live from a council tax point of view, but you can see there that we're only just slightly ahead of the Welsh average, and we're more or less in the middle of the pack there. That amount that we have to collect from council tax is increasing. And the reason that we're able to do it is we've got a wide range of properties. Now, the council, which receives the greatest funding per head of population in Wales, Blaen y Gwent, has also got the highest Band D rate. But they collect very little from Band D. Most of their money is collected from Band A. So MCC saw an 11.2% increase in its core funding for Welsh Government this time, above the All Wales average of 9.4%. It's welcome the Welsh Government funding will now go up for a third year following years of ongoing reductions. MCC still, though, remains the worst funded authority in Wales per head, and the settlement does not, as we saw, offset all the council's pressures and inflation, although it did go a long way towards assisting with that, it has to be said. Prudent provision has had to be made for pay awards. We still don't know what they are. Unions haven't agreed last year's yet, never mind next year's. COVID funding ends on the 31st of March. It'll then have to be met from existing budgets. We don't know what non-core specific grant funding is likely to come our way. We understand there may be some additional grant funding in the next couple of weeks, which may or may not assist with the situation after the end of March. But at the moment, we have to assume that we will have to find all COVID-related expenditure. General capital funding from Welsh Government has disappointingly reduced, 762,000 reduction for 22-23, and some specific capital grants streams have also reduced, but again we're waiting further clarification on that. So you can see there that we are still very substantially still the lowest funded per head in Wales, and you know that situation isn't going away anytime soon, as far as I can see. And if you look at the combined income, you see there that 40% that we have to collect compared to Blaen y Gwent's 20%. In fact, several authorities only have to collect around 20%. So we're having to collect double that from our residents, and it's because of our mix of housing, principally. But even on Welsh Government's own modelling, and this is one of their presentations, you know, they still recognise that Monmouthshire has a substantial shortfall compared to the Welsh average. So this budget recognises all pay and pension related spending pressures in schools up to a threshold of a 3% pay award. Anything over and above that will have to be met from the ISB. It recognises increasing demands placed on children's and adult social services and children with additional learning needs. Responds to the needs of the homeless. There's limited scope for frontline services to make efficiency savings, as we saw, and we will continue to drive for service efficiency and effectiveness. All fees and charges increases have been limited as much as possible, with that view that we mentioned earlier of all services, all local services still being maintained. So how are we fixed over the medium term? You saw that we had that those service pressures of 10.4 million and the pay pressures of 4.6 million, and that was relatively modest proposed savings coming through. But you take that modelling through the medium-term financial plan, and it shows, as we'll see in a subsequent slide, that we're still facing over the next couple of years some 13.6 million to have to come out of the budget or be replaced by grants. In year, we at month 6 saw that there was a 1.94 million overspend forecast. We're working very hard on that, trying to get rid of it as much as we possibly can. If we can mitigate or reduce the overspend, so much the better. If there's any of it left, that could spill over into 22-23, causing us more problems. Although, as I said earlier, we're still awaiting some news on potential Welsh Government grants, and that might assist with that. As you know, I mentioned it just now, we had a surplus on the budget for the last couple of years, and we've got a long history of working within budget. And we did top up the council fund in anticipation of some budgetary pressures coming up, and we'll continue to do that if indeed we're able to this year. There's a further 3.97 million deficit relating to COVID that the council expects to be fully funded from Welsh Government's COVID hardship fund. I see no problems with that. And as we know, we're still waiting the pay award negotiations, and hopefully that will come through before too long. There's capital slippage due to the ongoing challenging operating conditions and the impact both internally and externally in relation to COVID-19. So there's our overall budget, including all precepts, 255 million nearly. There's the service pressures added to that and the pay pressures. There's a modest amount of savings, the money from Welsh Government, the increased fees and charges, and that's 3 million, assuming the 3.95% council tax increase. And you can see there how that 863,000 that we are still faced with having to take out of reserves comes about. So looking at that in a pie chart, you'll see that most of the money, some 2/3 of it, goes on children and young people and social care and health. 12% of it goes on planning, waste, highways, all of those doing things. There's a small amount there which is to do with service in borrowing, and you'll see from that that the actual amount spent on servicing the requirements of the rest of the council are really quite small compared to those core services that we provide. So the next couple of slides I'm going to pass over very, very quickly, because most of you are members, or those of you who are not will be familiar with what the categories are. The children and young people, I don't have to tell you. Social care and health is services to adults and the most vulnerable children, and services around public protection. Enterprise is the doing stuff, that 12% in the green section in the previous slide. Monlife is the tourism, leisure and culture services. The chief executive unit deals with democratic services and legal. Resources are finance, ICT, HR, payroll, training, emergency planning, estates and property services, and all our commercial activities. And the other costs are relatively minor compared to those as we saw. So looking at that 10.4 million of unavoidable pressures, you can see that some of them crop up in children and young people, and we'll explore those in a minute. Social care and health, there's a lot of pressures there, but that will be no surprise if you listen to what's going on in the news. And enterprise has got its own problems with waste and highways. So the pressures that remain out of the control of the authority, driven by demand pressures, inflation and legislative changes, have been challenged where possible and managed or mitigated. But we have a pressure of 0.96 million with regard to children with additional learning needs. There's 1.3 million funding required for services for looked after children. There's another million sustaining the model of delivery in adult social care due to increased demand and complexity. Responding to an unsustainable social care market is giving us a pressure of another 1.9 million. And recycling and waste increased service delivery cost. We've had a massive increase in our recycling rates. Recycling is very, very welcome, but very, very expensive. And there's another 1.22 million that we're going to have to find to service that. The passenger transport unit has got a lot of pressures, 644,000, due to various factors. A lot of the contractors handing their contracts back because they've got problems in servicing them. And we've got a lot more children being transported now, so passenger numbers are up with those increased operating costs that we're all finding with our own vehicles. Grounds maintenance, another £273,000 worth of pressures there, 223 in public protection. We're having to build in £781,000 worth of pressures resulting from the council investment properties, but there's a lot of work going on there. We did have some voids due to people moving and some fatalities of the COVID period, but it's looking very positive now with regards to reletting, and hopefully we won't need all of that 781. Energy costs, they're increasing for everybody, and we're no exception, 446,000 there. And increases in town, community council and peace precepts is going to be in the region of 272,000. So we had those savings, that 1.6 million that I mentioned in the previous slide, and you'll see that none of those have come from children and young people. A bit more has come from enterprise. So after several years of making significant savings, as I said earlier, it's becoming increasingly more challenging, and you saw that from that second slide. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic, and where obviously at times it's had to be diverted to the emergency response to ensure vital services are delivered. It stopped them from carrying out the budget proposals from last year. So some of those have not yet been achieved, some have been delayed, and some have been lost. But as I said earlier, we're still working on reducing the potential overspend in the current year. So the in-year overspend, whilst it's being managed, could go through into 22-23 if we don't achieve what we were just talking about. So with this already challenging backdrop, it's made the budget challenge even more acute, although it was eased by the Welsh Government settlement. The savings package is therefore principally comprised, savings resulting from in-year decisions already taken, flexible use of capital receipts to fund costs of service reform, and increased income generations from fees and charges. We did have savings in waste and recycling because we changed from Viridor to Suez, and we got a lot of savings out of that change of contractor on our waste sites. There was the opportunity to make further use of guidance from Welsh Government with regards to utilising capital receipts to capitalise revenue costs relating to service reform. There's those increases in fees and charges that have been limited as much as we possibly can. And we've now finished with the street lighting programme, and there's £90,000 worth of savings from all of our street lights now being LED. All proposals are assessed early for equality, impact and well-being and future generations considerations, but inevitably any increase that we eventually decide on for council tax will affect members of the public. So will proposals for increases in fees and charges. Although the council tax reduction scheme is still there, and single person households are also eligible for 25% reduction on council tax. There's a lot more people on universal credit now through the pandemic, so that those schemes will be, or certainly the council tax reduction scheme will be available to them. And as you know, charges for domiciliary and residential care also means tested and a cap to mitigate the impact of those on the lowest incomes. So there's an ongoing commitment to fund the Future Schools programme in the capital budget. The business case is being approved. The planning application went in Friday or today, or certainly within the next couple of days anyway, for the Abergavenny 3 to 19 Band B school. Chepstow Comprehensive will follow in Band C. There's an ongoing commitment to the Cardiff Capital Region City deal. The Quick Road care homes being delivered, they're on site now. Investments maintained at current levels in the core programme for highways and property planned maintenance and county farms. We're keeping our amount of 900,000 available for disabled facility grants, and there's 250,000 for Access for All. As I mentioned before, we'll continue with the flexible use of one-off capital receipts to meet the cost of service reform. And there's £2.7 million worth of capital beds still to be assessed alongside that 762,000 reduction in our capital grant from Welsh Government for 22-23. And as we've said before, clarifications being sought with regards to specific Welsh Government capital grants. You're all aware that there's a substantial backlog of maintenance, but particularly with property, Disability Discrimination Act work. There's roads, rights of way, bridges, culverts, walls, a lot of work required if only the funding was there to do it. And we are reassessing all of that to try and prioritise where there's particular issues arising. So it'll be arresting road closures due to landslips. A lot of problems with ash tree dieback at the moment, where the trees are becoming brittle and dangerous. A lot of work going on with regards to homelessness and housing related provision. The provision of low cost affordable housing is always an issue. Digital infrastructure investment, we're doing a lot with the digital infrastructure with broadband in the remote areas. Transportation and active travel considerations, a lot of work going on there. Still work going on with the community amenity sites. Monlife investments, we've just done a lot of work in Abergavenny and the leisure centre upstairs. If the levelling up bid is successful, I know the first one wasn't, but we're trying again. In Caldecott, we'll do Caldecott Leisure Centre up as well, all to the standard that Monmouth was done a year or two back. We continue to be at the forefront of the climate emergency and carbon reduction commitments, and there will be match funding for specific grant funding schemes. The continued impact of the pandemic on the council, the local economy and its communities is a risk and uncertainty and can't be built into the budget because we don't know what it is, but we recognise that the pressure is there. And the risk that Welsh Government funding will not be forthcoming to fully meet the costs and income losses resulting from the pandemic, notably within homelessness, leisure centre income and adult social care. The extent of any further service pressures, given the volatility of some areas such as social care and children with additional learning needs, is another problem coming up. And the need for early clarification on levels of specific grant funding to help sustain some services that are wholly grant funded. To the extent that these risks materialise, then further budget recovery action will need to be taken in 22-23. So public finances and the needs of communities continue to be impacted in a truly unprecedented way as a result of the pandemic. Welsh Government have now provided indicative settlement projections for the next couple of years as a result of the UK Government and Chancellor publishing a 3-year comprehensive spending review. They hadn't for a while, so Welsh Government couldn't, but now they have, Welsh Government have, but these are noted as subject to change. Council tax increases over the medium-term financial plan. The modelling has been reduced to 3.95 over that period. And the pay award assumptions are updated in line with OPR forecasts, but we still don't know quite what they're going to end up as being. Further work has been undertaken to update service pressure estimates and savings opportunities over the medium term. And of course, there'll be a new political administration from May, and that will outline its priorities that will further inform the medium-term financial plan and strategy. So I mentioned earlier that 13.5 million of pressure coming up over the medium-term financial plan, and you can see how that's building. So there's some substantial problems looming ahead of us. So the budget proposals are available for consultation up to the 16th of February. 16th of February is the last date for suggestions that we might be able to incorporate in the budget because of the statutory work that has to be done on them. Anybody coming up with suggestions on the 3rd of March for council setting will have missed the boat, unfortunately, simply because of the legislative actions that have to be taken. So last suggestions by the 16th of February, please. Select scrutiny goes through until that date. Cabinet will issue the final budget proposals on the 2nd of March, and we'll be having our debate on them on the 3rd of March. So happy to get your thoughts and questions. We've got Will, Nikki and Tyrone here to answer any specific questions with regard to the Children and Young People Directorate. And anything that you think of that we missed today, you can go online or alternatively ask me direct. So that's it, Chair. I have got a couple more slides which are specifically to do with investment in services on children and young people. Nikki or Will, do you want me to share those, or do you just want to go to questions? If you'd like to come in and let me know.
I'm happy to share those.
Okay, I'll go to the first slide then, Nick. There you are.
Thank you. So this slide here is just showing the investments that we're making within children and young people to support our children with additional learning needs. So the first investment is 244,000 for recoupment income pressure. So this is money that we recoup from other local authorities for children placed in our schools. It's a pressure this year because we've seen a number of families actually move into Monmouthshire, so we're unable to claim from their home authority because we are the home authority. The next one is 277,000, and that's for children that we can't meet need within Monmouthshire County Council, so they go to independent placements outside in other independent placements to meet their needs. 138,000 for pupils placed in other local authority schools, very similar to the one above. Then we've got 298,000 for additional learning needs support for pupils placed within our own mainstream schools. So that's where they need additional support from members of staff, etc., or equipment, and that's given to our schools to support that. 15,000 for transport costs. I know that Councillor Murphy mentioned earlier the pressure on transport. And this is for specifically again for children with additional learning needs. And the final one is 37,000 for SENCOM, which is our hearing and visually impaired service, which is a joint service with other authorities, and there's inflationary pressures within that service. If I can have the next slide, please.
All right.
I've got.
Okay.
Yeah, can we go to the next slide?
Next slide, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was having trouble moving it for some reason, Nick. Sorry.
That's all right. That's fine. Just to remind members that we've got the ALN consultation out at the moment with a return date of the 11th of February. So just to remind members that obviously that's out with you, and we would welcome a response. There's two scenarios being consulted on. One is where we delegate funding to schools of 70% on pupil numbers and 30% on additional learning needs, and the other one is 80% on pupil numbers and 20% on additional learning needs. That's obviously been to CYP Select last week, and obviously we've had the, you know, as a group, we've had a opportunity to consult on that, but would welcome any returns that you want to send in. Next one. Yeah, so this is a specific investment in schools. So this is the pressure that we've got in schools. So we are modelling a 876,000 pay pressure for teachers' pay. So the maximum, as mentioned before, will be 3% that we will give out. So if the pay award is 2%, obviously we'll only give out 2%. If the pay award is 4%, we'll only give out 3%, and schools will need to fund the additional 1%. It's exactly the same for non-teaching pay, so that's for teaching assistants, etc., administrators within our schools. So that's modelled at 3%, and 29,000 for the school in Monmouth. There's a rates pressure there, which we've since the new build has come into being, and we've worked through all the rates now, so there's a pressure there of 29,000. So just a reminder as well of the grants that have been received by schools in the last couple of weeks. Schools have had a revenue maintenance grant of just over $1 million, 1.1 million. That relates to cleaning and caretaking in the majority, to support those costs there. There's a Winter of Wellbeing grant of 117,000, and then there's assistance of 184,000 to help with the new Additional Learning Needs Act that's coming in. So that's to give schools some money to help support that, getting ready for it. And there's 669,000 for the Triple R's, which is Raise, Recovery and Recruit grant that schools are used to, and they've had that out there. So that's all gone out. So that's just over 2 million for schools that's gone out in the last couple of weeks in Welsh Government grants.
Okay, well, that is the end of the presentations, Chair. So I'll come out with the
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Councillor Murphy, Cabinet Member, for resources and funding, etc. You've taken us through that very comprehensively, and thanks to Nikki as well for the CYP element. I've got one hand up in the speak now function. I've got Councillor Christopher Edwards, if you want to come in, Christopher.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Murphy, for your presentation, and Nikki as well. I must admit, I never get tired of hearing the words that the Council is committed to the Future Schools programme in its future funding. But I think my question may not be entirely appropriate for Councillor Murphy. Maybe one of the officers that may need to answer it. But looking at previous reports presented to this committee and where we are at the moment, the local authority in relation to school budgets, with school balances higher than they have been in previous years, or at least in the majority of cases, going forward, how will Monmouthshire County Council ensure that there's an appropriate balance with the schools and local authority expenditure? That's my first question. Should I ask my second one at the same time?
Yes, okay, if you give that, and then perhaps, okay. Or do you want to answer that first, Will?
I don't mind, Chair. I'm happy to take the second question from Councillor Edwards at the same time.
Well, okay, so just if you repeat the first one, just to be clear, ensure balance, please, Councillor Edwards.
Okay. The first one was with school balances higher than they have been in previous years, or at least in the majority of cases of schools in Monmouthshire. Going forward, how will the council ensure that there's an appropriate balance with the schools and local authority expenditure? And my second question is that, on my understanding, schools are continuing to receive sums of grant funding at the year end, and obviously we're fast approaching to that now. And I was wondering if this committee could have a report on these grant streams. In other words, providing full details of what schools have actually spent these resources on and what has been the impact of such expenditure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Edwards. Will McLean, Chief Officer, would you like to come in?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the questions, Councillor Edwards. I think if I take the last one first, as it were, I think that would be a really good report to bring before CYP Select. There has been a significant amount of grant funding through to schools in the recent past, throughout the period of the pandemic, in fairness, and there are some very significant funding streams, such as the RRS, or the Recruit, Recover, Raise Standards initiative. That's money which has been funded directly to schools to support learners, to help them catch up and to close the gap, which have sadly inevitably existed and potentially widened during the pandemic. We obviously work closely with our colleagues in the Education Achievement Service, EAS, to understand the impact of that expenditure, but I think that would be a good report to bring to CYP in the future. So yeah, more than happy to do that, and we'll work with our schools as well to find some of the really good examples of where that expenditure has made a big difference. And that leads nicely, I think, into your first question, and this is the question of balance. You'll have seen in the as we've kind of gone through the year that the authority has faced significant pressures in our ALN budget. That has been difficult for us to manage this year. And, you know, in particular, the costs associated with children remaining in county. As we look to that, I think it's appropriate for us to work with the schools in a really mature way to understand where the needs are. I think a great example of us doing that is the work that Nikki Wellington's been leading on revising the delegation methodology for additional needs funding. So I would hope to see more work like that in the future. Schools are going to probably, I think, see an uplift again in terms of school balances at the end of this year. That is likely to be inflated by year-end grants. Some of those will have very specific spending criteria attached to them, which will come back in terms of that report that we just talked about, but others will just go directly to the bottom line. And it's imperative that we are very clear with the schools that when significant balances have been accumulated, that they have really robust plans that that represent effective spending on their schools and their schools' populations. So we're talking to the schools about how we can help them to do that. We're talking about making sure that they understand the full flexibility and potential of procurement, especially local procurement. Thinking about things like the foundational and the circular economy. That would be of a really important aspect for us to consider, but also if there's capital expenditure, and some of the sums that schools have kind of been able to build up as reserves are significant enough to warrant some capital expenditure, that they do that in a fully informed way that meets all of the obligations around planning, building control and so on. So there's a lot of work with schools, but as we go forward, I think there probably will have to be a rebalancing between the money that the schools hold themselves for their investments and the money that centrally we're able to afford to support them. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Will McLean, for that. We go now then to County Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The budget mentioned the 21st Century Schools Programme in relation to Abergavenny and Chepstow, and the budget in relation to that. Could you actually comment on that, please? Thank you.
Will, do you want to come in on that?
On progress on it and building and so forth.
Yeah, of course. So thanks, Councillor Brown. So we're just reaching the kind of some crucial times around the new school in Abergavenny, with submission of the full business case imminent. as well as the submission for planning in the interim as well. So we're working through those processes at the moment. Members will be aware that Cabinet agreed on the 19th of January to take the final step in the consultation around the closure of the 2 schools and the opening of a new school. So that's now happened, and the call-in period concluded last Friday. So that will be enacted on the 1st of September 2023. So that's a significant positive step forward there. As we progress with the plans for Abergavenny, we're also very aware of the development that we want to see take place in Chepstow. I think members of this committee be aware that we've recruited a new member to the team called Tim Bird. He's our educational advisor. He's working with Kath Saunders, the 21st Century Project lead, on that, and we'll begin to look at Chepstow and the potential for Chepstow, what could potentially be done with the site as it is, what could be done with a casting our net a little bit more widely in terms of imagining what the future could be for that town. So that work is very much in hand, and as members have cited earlier, it's good to see that recognised as a commitment in the presentation from Councillor Murphy.
Okay, thank you, Will. Okay, we'll move now then to county question. Hand up to County Councillor Joanne Watkins. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's in relation to the ongoing and increased pressures that we're obviously seeing in children's services and looked after children. Can I please have a reassurance that even though the budgetary pressures are ongoing and seem to still be increasing steadily, that there will never be a scaling back in the preventative approach to stopping children from having to be taken into care? Obviously, they sometimes do have to be taken into care, and it's really important that they're given every possible opportunity at that point. But can I please have some reassurance that even though those pressures are increasing, we are still engaging in proper preventative approaches? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Watkins. Who's going to take this? Tyrone? Or bring in Tyrone then. Thanks. Thank you, Tyrone.
Hello, Chair. I'll take it first, and then if there's any thing to add, then the Chief Officer, James Rogers, can step in. In terms of our budgetary approach, Councillor, I think you asked a similar question on the last forecasting, and in terms of the budget, is good that we gain the interest from councillors, but with children's services, the pressure is just to allow us to still practice in the same way. We're not looking to change the way we practice. What we're looking to do with the budget pressure is recognise when the change in the need of the children, and even though the children looked after numbers, we gain some assurance there that they leveling out. What we gain is more high cost, more one-to-one bespoke placements required, and the pressure we got is more reflecting that rather than a change in practice. We're not looking to advocate any change in practice. With the pressures of £1.3 million, or just more than 1.3 million, it's broken down into 4 phases. One is to look into address the budgetary pressure with those children that require high cost bespoke placements. Unfortunately, they tend to be out of county. Is looking to stabilise our workforce, recognise the pressures that the court exhibit on us, and then the 4th element then is looking at rewarding or the pay structure towards our kinship carers following some legal cases in other local authorities, Councillor. But it is good to see the interest in the children, but again, even though there's certain assurances we can't give you, one assurance is we're not looking to change the way we practice. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Tyrone Slope. Thank you. Shane Rogers, Chief Officer, would you like to make any comments?
Thanks, Chair. Yes, totally echo what Tyrone has said there. There's no, our mandate within the service is still very much around early help, prevention right across the system, and we absolutely recognise that that's the way for us to build long-term sustainable, resilient families within Monmouthshire, so that there is no let up in our commitment to early help and prevention, both from a practice point of view and a service point of view.
Okay, thank you, Jane Rogers, Chief Officer. We go now then to next hand up, Councillor, well, Town Councillor for Mask, Maggie Harris.
Thank you, Chair, very much. Councillor Murphy, I just wanted to clarify my mind. I've listened, this is my second go at this budget. I'm not a budget girl, so I always have to listen hard. You're talking about the Welsh Government settlement. Can I just be assured that we're not being singled out because we're Monmouthshire? I presume they pay us to a certain formula of some kind or another, or is it that you feel that they just don't like us so we get less money?
Well, I have to admit there's a fair degree of consistency there, because Roger always asks me that.
Well, there we are.
Yeah, no, seriously, no, it isn't just because we're Monmouthshire. There's some 50 odd sets of criteria that's all brought together, a mix of housing, the length, the amount of roads we've got, the areas of deprivation that we've got, an awful lot of stuff, and different criteria, the number of children on school meals, all sorts of things shift around. And this year the balance shifted so that it basically turned on its head. So instead of being the worst funded, we were the best funded. Now there's no guarantee that's going to happen again, although given that £13.5 million worth of pressures over the medium-term financial plan, I'd be delighted if it does. But no, it's the way the formulas move that actually determines it. I know there is a perception that Welsh Government's trying to do us down, but no, I'm not going to level that one at them.
Thank you. Well, thank you also for the protection that you're going to give or maintain with the ALN and the supporting the deprivation areas that are around here in Abergavenny. As you know, we have
absolutely
1/4 of one section of our town is immensely deprived, and the support for families who've got children who require that support and the homelessness problem, I'm glad to see that you will maintain as best you can what support we can have. Thank you.
Yeah, we certainly will.
Okay, thank you, Maggie Harris, for that question, and obviously for Councillor Phil Murphy for his response. Are there any other questions or comments on the budget? I can't really see any. I don't propose. I made some sort of copious notes as Phil was speaking, but I don't propose to go through really any of those, in any detail. Now we've heard the whole budget, and I think it's clarified for many of us, particularly ones who've heard it before. It is a complicated process. The things that I would sort of just highlight are obviously the questions. The Councillor Chris Edwards raised the question about ensuring balance. Schools have. I don't want to use the word benefit, because schools have been through such a hard time in terms of trying to keep open, teaching online, dealing with COVID amongst staff and pupils, that yes, the budgets are up, but they've had incredible pressure, and so have the youngsters, to be fair, and we've yet to go through the exam period. So it's been a very tough time in school. I'm reassured by what Will McLean said in terms of balancing that, and in terms of balancing for some schools large budgets now at the end of the year. Certainly I think it's important that children who suffered, and obviously all children suffered, but if you look at any of the facts and figures across England and Wales, it tends to be children from more deprived backgrounds and that are not well resourced. They are the ones that have suffered so much in terms of online teaching and struggling with computers and iPads, etc. So I think that needs to be kept in mind. and obviously the ALN pressures in the county, that, you know, those are certainly quite large. I'm certainly reassured when Nikki Wellington brought the paper about the new ALN formula to the finance group about a week or so ago, to actually get a grip on that. Now, I think it will make for much better funding, and funding that schools can actually plan with and to, rather than having money and then children moving on and that money being taken away. So I think that, you know, better stability for ALN funding is certainly worthwhile. Obviously, you know, King Henry School, not King Henry, the Abergavenny School Development is moving on. I was at a meeting this morning with Tim Bird and Kath Saunders, and I'm in many ways reassured there about what's happening. And obviously Chepstow is a major concern, particularly obviously for people living in the Chepstow area and sending their children to that maintained school. In terms of the lack pressure, obviously that is always an area of concern. I sit on the corporate parenting committee, and certainly, you know, from a personal sort of perspective, obviously that budget has to be protected, and it is probably more unpredictable than budgets coming through in other areas of CYP, such as schools and education. If children come into the authority and need care, then obviously no one is going to actually turn that down. But having said that, some children coming in do obviously have quite high resource implications. They have to go into specialist placements, and that obviously is a concern. Certainly reassured by what Tyrone Stokes said, and the Chief Officer Jane Rogers, that obviously big emphasis on prevention and then support for those children, so that they're coming from resilient families that can cope with some of the pressures that modern day life throw up. And the last question from Councillor Maggie Harris, though I certainly don't, you know, I'm glad Councillor Murphy reassured us there that there's nothing in a sense that Welsh Government are doing to Monmouthshire more than they're doing to any other authority. The grant funding system is obviously incredibly complex. And the last thing I would say is, yes, it's good to see that pay will be dealt with centrally. You know, school budgets, even with some of this extra money that's coming in, are still pretty tight, I think, in terms of what schools are trying to do. So I'm reassured by that. Certainly from what I've heard today, overall, I'm taking it that the committee are reasonably happy with the budget proposals that County Councillor Phil Murphy has brought before us today, and I'm really grateful to him and all the other senior officers who have contributed to this really worthwhile discussion. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. So thank you, Phil. We'll move on now then to the next item on the agenda, and we go now then to agenda item 4, which is going to be led by the Youth Offending Service, and this is to provide a report on the aims and objectives of the service, and to discuss the outcomes for children and young people, and importantly the impact of the service. So I'll hand over now to the lead on the Youth Offending Service report. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. For those who I haven't met before, my name is Chesney Chick. I'm the service manager for Monmouthshire and Torvine Youth Offending Service. I haven't prepared any kind of files in preparation for this afternoon's kind of committee meeting. What I plan to do is just talk you through certain elements of the report, if that's okay, Chair.
Right, thank you. Yes.
Take any questions at the end. I'm also conscious it's quite a lengthy report, so apologies for that. What I plan on doing is just kind of giving a brief overview of the service and kind of the makeup of it and some of the work, and then talking a little bit more depth then to the thematic inspection that was undertaken when we went into lockdown back in 2000 2020, I think it was March time, to talk about that kind of inspection, the thematic inspection that was then, the recommendations made by that inspection, and how we as a service have responded to those kind of recommendations. So if that's okay with you, Chair,
yes,
that would be the plan.
Okay, that's
so
fine. Thank you.
Are you happy for me to share the report, or are people
Yes,
just
yes,
happy?
yes, and
so
then if you take us through it, as it were, succinctly then, or briefly, in terms of just highlighting that the main and the important points that obviously far better than members of the committee. Thanks.
Can members see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Just bear with me a moment. So, as I've said, I'll just take you through kind of an overview of the kind of service, and then kind of highlight some specific issues, recommendations, and how then we kind of responded to it. So, the Youth Offending Service is a multi-agency, it's made up of multi-agency professionals, and together we have an aim to prevent offending and reoffending in children by challenging their behaviours and raising awareness of the consequences of offending and antisocial behaviour. Monmouthshire and Torvine Offending Service provides service to children to divert them from offending and reoffending. This is achieved by carrying out effective assessments and interventions and working in partnership with other agencies. The YOS encourages children to repair the harm to victims and restore relationships with the community. Children are encouraged, where possible, to meet with the victims to hear how their behaviour has affected them and agree actions that can repair the harm caused. And I put an Appendix F with the report for members to look at. It sets out the data for offences of each year. The YOS values the diversity of children and helps them to achieve their potential. It works with parents and carers in supporting behaviour change within children and families. COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdowns presented significant and unprecedented challenges to all areas of life, but most particularly to the critical services provided by social care. The children and families supported by Monmouthshire and Torvine YOS deserve the highest quality provision and service delivery, and the staff of the YOS have worked tirelessly and selflessly to ensure that these standards have been maintained. This has been achieved in collaboration with all partners. During the pandemic, Monmouthshire and Torvine YOS experienced a reduction of approximately 20% in overall referrals. And there's a number of factors that kind of have impacted upon these. So the courts, as you will recall, shut down during the initial period. There was changes in the role of police during that initial period also, which impacted upon referrals and throughput. Partner agencies not processing referrals into us. Lockdown measures, so there wasn't large groups congregating in kind of town areas or wherever. And I think significantly affected was the closure of schools and training provisions, whereas there would be that monitoring of kind of children that was no longer there. So, as I said, we've seen approximately 20%. What I would say, these figures revert back to the initial period of lockdown, and what we've seen in the most recent figures that are now coming through in our data is that the figures are kind of where they were pre-pandemic. Monmouthshire and Torvine, as you'll be aware, kind of covers the boundaries of two local authorities, which is obviously Torvine and Monmouthshire. The Offending Service is hosted by Monmouthshire County Council and sits within kind of social care and the health directorate. All non-seconded staff are employed by Monmouthshire County Council, and this provides consistency in terms of conditions of service and general human resource management. And I then manage by the head of children's services. The YOS is governed by a local management board, which is chaired by the Chief Officer of Torvine County Borough Council, and the Vice Chair position is assumed by the head of Monmouthshire Children's Services. This ensures appropriate representation and levels of decision making and influence across both local authority areas. And there's another appendix that kind of shows you the kind of breakdown of the management board. So if I just kind of add, so the local management board LMB meets on a quarterly basis and is timed in order to correspond to the availability of ratified and confirmed performance information, which informs a standing agenda item. Financial matters and planning continue to be a standing item on the local management board. The board continues to provide governance and assumes responsibility for the strategic direction of YOS. Some of the LMB business plans include financial reporting, planning, performance measures, progress against relevant action plans, and overall capacity and capabilities. We're also governed nationally by the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales. The main functions of the YJB is to monitor the operation of the youth justice systems and the provision of youth justice services within England and Wales. The YOS is required to submit a YJB plan on an annual basis to the YJB on matters regarding the structure and governance, review of performance, resource and value for money, partnership arrangements, and risk to future delivery. So that's kind of the service. If I just then take you to the recommendations and action points as a result of the inspection, and I'll take you through that. There's 9 in all. Only one really was regarding the youth offending service. The others were the other recommendations were more aimed at partnering agencies and so on and so forth. So if I just talk you through our responses to them, then perhaps take some questions after them. So the first one is develop effective communication systems between custodial settings, courts, and youth partners agencies so that children are not disadvantaged and have timely court hearings and resettlement needs can be met. So as the manager of the youth offending service, alongside my colleagues within Caerphilly, Blaenau Gwent and Newport, we met on a regular basis and certainly prior to the lockdown to ensure that the needs of the children continue to be met whilst the custody units and communication was maintained with the courts and YOS partners agencies during the challenging period. This protocol was reviewed and updated and when needed, e.g. easing of restrictions, information and direction received from external sources such as the YB, the YOS had no control over the closure of the youth courts. Sorry, I'm getting a bit confused with you. Sorry, I do apologise. So in a nutshell, basically what we were in a position to do was, draw together a action plan ensuring that the communication between youth offending services and police custody units and other relevant agencies were in place prior to the lockdown, ensuring that children's needs, if they found themselves in those settings, were met. So we drew together an action plan where staff could go into those units safely and ensure that the appropriate measures were taking place, i.e. PPE was available, social distancing was in place, so making sure that the children and families or the staff members were safe at all times. So to support the development of specific approaches to managing child and adolescents parent violence that protects the victims during the period of lockdown. The thematic inspection highlighted national increase in recorded incidents of domestic abuse, specifically in relation to child on primary caregiver. It suggested that this could attribute to the restrictions created as a result of the pandemic. So HMIP thematic inspection findings identified the opportunity to develop provision, service, delivery as a result of issues created from COVID-19 pandemic. So this was emotional health and well-being of children following extended lockdown periods, increased incidents of domestic violence perpetrated by children against their parent or carers. At the core of our standards is requirement that the provision of service delivery of YOS is be both child-centred and innovative. So in light of this, we ensured that our parent workers were very proactive in identifying those those vulnerable families and providing them with the support and assistance that they required to ensure or to hopefully ensure that the issues faced on a national level wasn't the kind of case with Torfaen and Monmouthshire. and this was not specifically for the parent workers, also other workers within the service carried out this to ensure those kind of pressures faced by families at this very, very difficult time were averted. So, third point, support YOS to assess and respond the digital divide for children and families so that children have safe and reliable access to IT to continue the education and keep in contact with professionals they're involved with. Monmouthshire and Torfaen is ETE worker predominantly liaise with all, sorry, if I take it back, we undertook a survey of all children and families that we supported during the initial period of lockdown. That then kind of informed us of some of the difficulties faced. With that information to hand, our workers, ETE worker, parent workers, ensured then that the digital poverty divide wasn't an issue for those families supported by YOS. So some of the things that our ETE worker did was to ensure that if available from education on schools and so on, if the children didn't have access to the appropriate IT equipment, they were kind of provided by schools or other voluntary organisations. Review caretaking and transfer process between YOS in light of remote and virtual service delivery, putting the child's best interest at the centre of decision making. What usually happens if we are supporting a child that's outside the area in which they're from, i.e. sort of Monmouthshire, and they're then supported into Blaenau Gwent or Swansea, very often our caretaking arrangements would be that that area would be made aware of that child and then support them and undertake the plan that is drawn up by Monmouthshire. But during pandemic, the decision was made that we would maintain virtual contact and, if needed, also face-to-face contact, just to support those children through what it was a very, very difficult period. 5, work with partners to understand the level of child on parent violence, their areas, and ensure that help is available and support to protect parents who are victims. This wasn't necessarily an issue for us, as I said, as it was on a national basis, but what we did was use the relevant workers within the service to ensure that support that was in place to prevent families having to have unnecessary pressures placed upon them. So parent workers based with us were identifying those families, sharing those names with children's services to make sure that there was bespoke and robust plans in place for all those families. 6, identify the backlog of cases that are being processed through courts and ensure that there is significant workforce capacity to deal with the increased caseloads. We worked tirelessly with other managers and partner agencies to identify what cases, if any, were pending. We supported those families that were in the court system prior to the pandemic to make sure that they were fully aware of any delays, inform them that should they have a date, to explain to them the changes in arrangements due to the pandemic. So things like they would have specific time slots, there would be social distancing, just to break down some of those concerns and anxieties around that. Again, what we identified within Monmouthshire and Torfaen is that the envisaged backlog never came to fruition. So whereas we thought that there would have been a number of cases held up in that judicial system, that wasn't necessarily the case with the Gwent, where courts were very proactive in making sure that those cases were seen in a timely way. 7, work with partners to include children who are defined as high vulnerability by YOS within the local definition of vulnerable children for the purpose of priority access to education and other services. As I've already mentioned, we work closely with our colleagues in children's services, making sure that if there were cases of high risk and vulnerability, those names and cases were shared with the appropriate professionals, ensuring that plans were in place for those families to receive the appropriate levels of support. 8, consider how this group of children are to be reintroduced to school, education, employment, and our attainment gap is to be addressed. As I said, our ETE worked very, very closely with all the establishments throughout Monmouthshire and Torfaen to ensure that there was a clear line of communication, therefore preventing any kind of gaps in kind of educational attainment. He kind of worked very closely with some of the children on our kind of caseload, ensuring that they didn't fall behind by doing one-to-one sessions with them, taking them through all sorts of qualifications whilst the pandemic was going on. And 9, routinely assess children's access to IT and remote communication methods as a standard part of our assessment. As I said, only one of the recommendations are specifically aimed at youth offending service, this being the one. What we've done in response to this ensured that as part of our assessment process, which is the Asset Plus, we ensure that all children are assessed, and this is considered. So part of the questions that we now ask is as to whether they've got access to appropriate IT and are able to kind of access remote learning. So that is something now as part of the process that we undertake with families. If there is a shortfall, i.e. that they haven't got the necessary equipment, we work tirelessly then to ensure that it's in place for them so they don't fall behind or are kind of left isolated. That's it from kind of the report. Sorry, I've kind of hammered through that very quickly and probably not done it justice, so I do apologise for that, but is there any questions?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Chesney Chick, for that report. There's obviously quite a lot to take in and from quite a dense document in terms of the text. Councillor Maureen Powell has got a hand up.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Chesney, for that report. It's a long report, and you did very well to place it so we could get the main information. There's a couple of questions I want to ask. Well, I'll put it all into one, and then it'll be easier, I expect. I mean, my idea is also always prevention is better than cure, but I know we can't cure everything by preventing it. 2 questions, really. How soon do you come aware of the potential offenders? You know, does that happen quite often? And the other one is, that I'm interested in, is while the lockdown was there and there were less of them out on the streets, did you find that the online bullying and influencing rose, and was there anything you could do about it? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Councillor Powell. There may be, I may need to come back to you on one of those questions, but if I start by trying to kind of respond to the initial one, which was, and I try to kind of paraphrase, is that what we do as a service to identify those early signs of children who may come into our kind of service. So first and foremost, you know, we are very much kind of a preventative service, and I think there's been a very large shift, certainly before I kind of joined the service, where they didn't want to be dealing with people in custodial settings. They wanted to be doing it in the community on a preventative agenda. So what we do is work very, very closely with our colleagues in children's services and education and other partner agencies to identify those who kind of may have some trigger points, whether that's ACEs or others, that would kind of indicate that they are possibly going to come to our attention. And what we then do is look at services, and that's not necessarily ours, but you know, in collaboration with our partners, perhaps from kind of the youth service, to develop resources within a particular area. There's some issues that start to arise around antisocial behaviour, for instance, so we can do some specific work there. If it's on an individual basis, we would look to see whether there's a service in-house that could meet their needs. And I'll give you another example, and I didn't touch upon it when I was given the précis of the report, is that during the lockdown, as I touched upon, there was it was identified that there was an increase in kind of domestic violence, child on a primary carer. Now, the information and data available to me from Monmouthshire and Torfaen Children's Services didn't indicate that that was the case for us, but I accept that given that schools and other organisations weren't in, that figure may not have been a true figure that was provided. But what we did as an organisation is created 2 posts that sit within children's services and their MASH and their front door services that would help with that process, so they would help identify those potential cases and others that would be coming to our attention, so we can kind of, if you like, swim upstream a little further to kind of catch them on a preventative agenda rather than wait for them to come to our attention after a crime has been committed, so to speak. So I hope that kind of answers your question and kind of gives you some understanding of the measures that we take. The other question, sorry, you'll have to remind me of what it was. Sorry,
it was about the extra online bullying. Was there extra online bullying because they weren't out in the streets? But online bullying can often be worse because they'll say things online that they would never say face to face. And I think this has been one of the problems, especially when we hear, dreadfully, we do hear of the odd teenager committing suicide, and very often nobody really knows why. And when you look into it, you find that they have been bullied online, and it can be quite nasty. And I wondered, had that increased when we had the lockdown? And if so, is there anything that can be done to alleviate it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you again for kind of reiterating that, Councillor Powell. I think first and foremost, there was no data to suggest that there'd been an increase in bullying during the lockdown period. I think anecdotally there were some kind of messages, stories coming through that is a potential, but nothing that came directly to the attention of the Youth Offending Service to address and go out and kind of look at in greater depth. What we did do, however, during the kind of pandemic is that, and continue to kind of use some of those resources with regards to kind of Teams and other virtual platforms, is to engage the children that we're involved with, and not necessarily specifically around kind of reparation that they may be undertaking, or kind of specific sessions with them. What we tried to do is fill as much of their time as we possibly could. So during the holiday period of that period, so for instance the summer, we would put out quizzes to them. We would ask them to become involved with that. We would send out packs, for instance, in the post that may be kind of making something, and then we would have them back in, mark them, and give out prizes, whether it's kind of book tokens and stuff like that. So what we did try to do is ensure that they were engaged at all time, and surprisingly and pleasantly surprised we were that there was a great uptake in those sessions, and certainly lots of the young people that we would have anticipated didn't want to engage actually did engage and found it on times much easier to engage in that virtual world. And I possibly is because they felt they had more control because they could switch us off at any time.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was excellent answer. And of course, as well as that, when they're at home, they haven't got they're not showing off in front, although they know the other people sitting, they're not showing off in front of each other as they might in a class, so possibly. But I'm so pleased that you provided those competitions for them and there was a good uptake. Thank you very much.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you both. Move now then to Councillor Louise Brown. Take her hand up.
Yes, thank you very much for the report. I was just wondering, in the reports and appendixes, it's a joint service with Monmouthshire and Torfaen, and I wondered if there was any breakdowns of the numbers you got for each particular local authority area at all, and if this changed over time. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, there is a breakdown, and that's something that I'm more than happy to come back and present on some of the statistical information that is available to the Youth Offending Service. But anecdotally, there is a difference in the throughput, if you like, of Torfaen as opposed to Monmouthshire. I think that's been a long-standing kind of difference. And then that didn't change throughout the pandemic. So, and I couldn't give you specific kind of numbers, but for instance, in a week. And I'd have to look and check, but for an example, if we had, say, 10 from Torvine, the number from Monmouthshire would be somewhere around about 7 or 5 possibly. That was certainly my understanding pre-pandemic of the figures. I think what we are starting to see that is starting to level out. I think that the throughput is still higher within Torvine than it is in Monmouthshire, but I think that the gap is kind of closing. And the other thing I think is worthwhile mentioning is that the complexities of the cases, although they're smaller, but not significantly so now in Monmouthshire, the complexities are still the same. Sometimes you'll have different issues from different presenting areas. So it's interesting to see that within Torvine, it could be drug-related and violence, and in Monmouthshire or Abergavenny, it's slightly different. Now, I don't want to say it's this and it's something else without having that data to hand. And again, as I said, I'm more than happy to present, but it is interesting looking and kind of bottoming out exactly what's going on in a particular area, and going back to the previous questions, that's what we look at very often then on a preventative agenda to say, well, okay, what could we be doing, say, for instance, in CHEP, so to reduce this? So if it's around drugs, do we get engaged to kind of do specific pieces of work in the schools that surround that area? So those are the kind of questions we ask ourselves, and that's the plans we then look to put in place.
Yes. Councillor Louise, goodness.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask another question. In relation to housing for young people, the reports that we've had to adults suggest that the young people who need housing are presenting with more complex needs, including drug problems and so forth. I mean, I appreciate that doesn't necessarily mean that they are necessarily offend, but just wondered what linkages you also had with housing on a multi-agency basis, and what support was provided for the housing side in terms of complex needs. Thank you.
Oh, okay, so for all cases that kind of have involvement from the Youth Offending Service, we have what's called a Resettlement Panel, and that specifically looks at very often our exit strategy. So whether a child has been in custody and then is leaving to return to the community, we would have a resettlement panel and they would be discussed. But also, similarly, we would have a prevention case that come to the end of its order, the child come to the end of its order, they would also be discussed to ensure that there's the right level of support when they're exiting our provision. Now, on that panel is housing, is Careers Wales, is kind of health. We have a CPN very often sits there to ensure those, and a drugs worker from Engage, to ensure the package support when they're in the community, no longer being supported by the Youth Offending Service, is the right level, is robust, so it supports them. And it's well documented that children are coming through with more kind of complex needs, and Youth Offending Service doesn't see anything different to that. It's very much the same. And what we try to do, as I said, is within those bespoke package of support is ensure that they have the right level of support. We have good relationships and communications with housing. Unfortunately, there are occasions where they can only kind of do what they can do, and what's within their gift they will give. But very often it's because they haven't the provisions available sometimes, those bespoke packages that are sometimes, the placements and accommodation that are sometimes required. But I know that from discussions with my colleagues in housing in Monmouthshire and Torvine, it's something that's constantly on the agenda, and it's something that they're constantly looking to develop.
Yeah, if you've got a final question,
yeah, just to quickly come back on it. I mean, I think that obviously one of the things is that the local authority is obviously has a housing responsibility, but it doesn't necessarily have a security or a health responsibility with regard to misuse of drugs and complex drug problems. And I think that's one of the problems that they are finding is in relation to the support available for those extra needs, which not necessarily all registered social landlords are able to provide.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think it's vitally important from our perspective is to ensure that through the assessment process and our involvement with the child is that we identify the core need, because very often they'll get masked by other things. So perhaps, you know, historically we've been working with the drug issue. Well, in actual fact, it's more of a kind of emotional well-being, mental health issue. So that's what we look to do. And ensure that when we put the package of support together and they're in the community, is that there, as I said, the relevant support is in place. So whether that be drug kind of engaged involvement with them to help them address their kind of drug misuse, or whether, as I said, be a mental health issue, and you hope that with the right support they're able then to manage independently within the community.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Brown. Thanks, Chesney. Any other questions? Anybody else wants to come in? Peter Strong, do you want to come in on anything? No.
I'm fine, thanks. I just wanted
Okay,
to...
okay. Thanks for that. Well, Chesney, obviously, first and foremost, thanks for your report and for taking us through it. In terms of, hopefully the committee is now a bit clearer about how COVID has affected the service during this period. It's obviously been a difficult period for everybody, but particularly for some children and teenagers who are probably in difficult circumstances, and it's quite sort of concerning. I've read about it in the newspaper about the increased level of domestic violence of particularly teenagers, but even younger children against their carers or against their children. So, you know, it's been useful to have that report this afternoon and to hear about the support that families have had during the lockdown. I think the question that Councillor Maureen Powell raised, particularly about prevention, and certainly that, you know, that's a perspective that I would come from, is that obviously teenagers and possibly younger children who come into contact with the youth offending service, we really don't want to see them moving on into the sort of adult criminal world, or them ending up in adult prison or youth prisons. Prevention is obviously the key. We certainly don't want to see children moving on, but certainly some of those are in very difficult circumstances, and it is heartening to hear that there is support for them and advice, because perhaps many of those children do not have the backup of a well-resourced family and well-resourced parents to sort of help them out of that period of difficulty. And I'm sure the key message that comes from members this afternoon, myself included, is one of prevention and of support, rather than it being sort of punitive and of those teenagers ending up in the adult sort of prison care. Really, it is worrying. I'm sure that there must be quite a strong link there. Also, the issue of bullying, you know, and online bullying when teenagers have been locked away for, you know, quite a long time, and that's obviously put a pressure on them, and it's put a pressure on families. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for the input, Chesney, and thanks to the councillors who asked the questions. I'll move on now then to the final item on the agenda, which is just to note that the next meeting of CYP, this was an extra meeting to cover budget and youth offending services, but the next meeting now is on the 3rd of March at 10 o'clock, with obviously a pre-meeting of members at 9:30. So thanks for your attendance this afternoon, thanks for the presentations, and diolch yn fawr, and I hope have a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you. So I'll now officially close the extra CYP meeting this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks.